Hi, my name is Jolene Phelps, and I've got an amazing story. I feel like it's amazing what God has done in our family and in me. And so I thought I'd just kind of start out by giving you a little background about like our family, just my family, like how I grew up, and so you kind of get a sense of where I'm coming from. So my mom is actually an immigrant from Cuba, and she came when she was 18 along with her mother and 3 sisters. And they had lived in communism for about 10 years when Johnson did his freedom flights. And so they, at the time, her brother and dad had to stay back in Cuba because he was military age. So they separated the family and they came, and just with the clothes on their backs, and their story is amazing. It's hilarious. Like my mom, I mean, their stories are like Amelia Bedelia books if you've ever read those. It's really hilarious. But anyway, this was during the hippie era, right? Free love, and my grandmother has these 4 teenage girls, and so she's kind of thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to keep these daughters safe? In Cuba, they would have had a chaperone everywhere, when they went on a date or anything. So such a different world. So 2, Mormon missionaries show up at their door, and they're all clean cut. They don't have the long hair, and they have these really good standards. And my grandmother didn't really believe the doctrine. She thought it was actually kind of crazy, but she thought, okay, my girls will be safe here. So they convert, and later they go to BYU, and my mom and dad, my dad actually was on the same mission, and they knew each other in New Jersey, but then they met again at BYU, and so they got married. And so they weren't super active when I was growing up. They'd kind of go every once in a while, but not super active in the Mormon church. And eventually they got a divorce, and I was about 12. And at that point, I had always prayed. I always loved God, but I started to need Him more, just with my parents going through this divorce. So all I knew of religion was Mormonism. We lived in Arizona at the time, and my aunt and uncle lived nearby, and they were super strong Mormons. And so I'd always go to church with them. And eventually, I was the oldest in our family, and I have a brother and a sister, and I would just drag my family to church. And so we became much stronger as I entered, junior high and high school. And then fast forward a bunch of years, so I continued active all my life. And then I was married before James, but and I had a little girl. And but then later on, that marriage didn't work out so well. When Rinsley was about 4, Rinsley's our oldest daughter. She's 22 now. James and I got married. And so we were about 30 at that time. And we were very strong LDS members, holding callings, going to the temple, all these things. But in the meantime, my sister and my brother had left the Mormon church. My sister is a doctor. She was called to teach the gospel doctrine class in her ward, and she started to see things about Joseph Smith that she had never heard before, about his polygamy and all this stuff, and became very disheartened about Mormonism, and she left. And then my brother left after her, and they both became agnostic, and I was freaking out. I'm like, oh, their life is gonna end. Because, in Mormonism, they tell you pretty much if you leave, you lose your salvation, your family's gonna fall apart, and your kids are gonna get on drugs, and, so that's what you grow up thinking. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, James, their lives are falling apart, and, and to be honest, they kind of did a little bit. So both my sister and brother ended up divorced. My sister, they really did a pendulum swing. They thought, okay, well, life is just for fun. And so her husband was an FBI agent. And they had a great marriage before. And then it really did fall apart, because they were just having fun. And so then James was like, you know what, don't be so hard on them. He's like, I actually have a lot of questions too. And that was the first I had heard about his questions. So I'm like, what, you do? So he, it actually brought us closer together for a while, because he was starting to share what had been on his heart, and he was kind of holding it in. And so we'd go on hikes, and he'd share these questions that he had, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, I don't know, that's a good question. But I was so, I loved the church, it's all I knew. And so I would search his questions within the apologetics of the Mormon church. I didn't go outside. I was like, so then I pacified myself. I was like, this is okay, this is true. And so, but I was really actually okay. Like if he had decided, no, you know what, Mormonism's not true, I could see a very unhappiness in him, and that made me sad. And so I did tell him, like, look, if you want to leave, it's okay, but I do believe it's true. I'm going to keep staying. But he didn't want to rock the boat. He didn't want to rock, just his family is pioneer descent Mormons, 10 kids in the family. Only one brother has left the church, and he's atheist. And so he just didn't, he's like, I don't know of a better way. And so to raise a family. So we continued to stay. Fast forward, that was in 2010 when he started to share the questions. So fast forward 4 years. At this point, Rinsley, our daughter, is 14. She was an ice skater at the time. She was like she was quite competitive, trying to get to the Olympics. She breaks her ankle, and she loses that fearlessness that she had in her. So on a whim, she enters the singing contest in Scottsdale, Arizona, and she wins the first night. And so she's like, this is what I'm called to. So that brought us to, like, we started searching for like a performing arts school for high school. And we find this one. It's called Kimber Academy. And they call themselves like a Christian private school. It's really not Christian. It's actually all run by Mormons. And so we go, and she's loving it. And the first hour of every day is just spent studying the scriptures. And they're studying Book of Mormon, but also Bible. And so she really is like, it's funny, like Rinsley was never one to really love school. She's very much more about the arts, but she starts loving school, and she is loving this first hour of scriptures. Like she actually, in this process, her teacher, who was quite a different thinker, she was the director of the school, says to the kids that, like, you guys can see Jesus. You just need to ask him. And so Rinsley goes in her room, and she says, you know what, I just really believed her. And so I just prayed to God, okay, Jesus, I'm ready to see you. And she said, of course, nothing happened. But stuff did start to happen, because she was quite the prima donna before. If people knew her, I mean, James could tell you, she was difficult to be around sometimes. She just really thought highly of herself. But God started to change her, and she started to soften. She started to be nicer to her brothers, and I'm like, something's going on. It's different. And so we become really good friends with the director of the school. And one day we're at her house, and she just like spills the beans. Like, I don't believe in the prophet of the Mormon church anymore. And she was a very strong Mormon. She even had a son on a mission in Russia. And she's like, he's not a real prophet. And Rinsley right away, she's like, I believe it. He's not. I know he's not. And I'm like, what? I don't know this. Anyway, but quickly soon after, I was like, yeah, when's the last time he ever prophesied? So he's probably not. And so she starts to share about these books she's been reading. And so I don't know if you guys have heard his name, but there's a guy that was Mormon, and he's kind of one of the many splinter off groups that have formed from the Mormon church. And his name is Denver Snuffer. And so he has tons of books out there. So she starts sharing, and I start reading his books, and there's like family groups that are forming and just having home church. And so I start going to one, and then I'm telling James, you really need to read this stuff. It's like amazing. I think it'll answer our questions, And it's just to give you an overview what they basically believe. So they believe that Joseph Smith was definitely a true prophet, that he wrote that the Book of Mormon is true, but everything after Joseph Smith is like false. Like Brigham Young and every prophet after that, they messed up. And so they really believe in Joseph Smith. So this guy is a historian, and he really digs in to Joseph Smith. And some of the things, like, he justifies polygamy because he doesn't believe in polygamy. In fact, he's actually helped a lot of polygamous groups stop polygamy and just like not continue it. He doesn't say for them to get divorced, but he's like, just don't continue it. So in that way, it's been good. But what he justifies is really kind of strange. He says that Joseph Smith was not really consummating these marriages because there's no evidence that he's had children. He said that that it was more about, and he's got all these documents. I mean, there's some strange doctrine out there from Joseph Smith, that Joseph Smith was telling these people that were following him that if they're white, in some cases they're white, but they're young daughters and stuff, that they had to marry him. So he was a direct line to Jesus. And so if they married him, and then their whole family would be saved. So it's really sad. Like, these girls were marrying Joseph Smith, these young girls, and, not going to have a future anymore, but they thought they were doing the right thing because they thought they were making the sacrifice for their whole family line. And so this is what, Denver Snuffer is teaching. So it kind of justifies like the whole polygamy thing that you have questions about. And so I remember sharing it. Oh, and then so they believe that, and then they also believe that we need to have communion often. So these home family churches were getting together and they were taking communion. They would call it sacrament, but with real wine. They're like, Joseph Smith drank, that's not a commandment. So you're taking communion with real wine and bread and just having a great time. And also they believed that you had to get baptized again, because in the Mormon church you're getting baptized into an organization. It's not really fully about Jesus, so that we have to get baptized again, but not just once, many times, because you need to. It's kind of a works thing. It's like the more you get baptized, the closer you're getting to God, because you're progressing more and more. That's the gist of this little splinter off group. And now I'll just call them from here on out the remnant group, because that's what they're calling themselves, I think, these days. So at that point, Rensley and I start meeting with these family groups, and for the first time in my life, I actually started feeling really alive, because what they were doing good was teaching relationship. And in the Mormon church, they don't. It's like they tell you to pray, but nobody really teaches you to pray and spend time with God and just really wait for his answers and hear, and they'll tell you, yeah, we do, but they don't model it. So or at least not in my experience. And so I'm all of a sudden spending all this time, like every morning, with Jesus and God, who, Jesus I thought was God. And so I was spending all this time, and I'm feeling alive for the first time in my life. And so I'm like so excited. And I'm like, James, this is it. So James starts to read the Denver Snuffer books, and he just says, Jolene, you know what? I've got a pit in my stomach. This is not good. But I'm like feeling alive. I can't just let go of this, So he is still studying it out. He's like, give me a chance to just study it out. And he goes out and he shared this in his testimony, but I'll just quickly touch on it. So he goes out on a camping trip with the boys, and Rensley and I are left home, because they always did this annually. And this group were doing baptisms again. And so I'm like, I really want to get baptized. And so I just called him up. James, I really want to get baptized, and because I wanted to at least tell him, and he's like, well, can't you just wait? And I'm like, no, I just can't wait. So I feel really bad now. I've repented a lot, because I know it was very hurting to him that I just went ahead and did it and didn't wait for him. And so after that, we continue meeting with these groups, and our marriage, was already kind of having a hard time. Not big things. It was more like communication issues. Like, James is a busy attorney, and just like I think many men, he, with all the busyness and stuff that goes in, he just would kind of go inside, and he wouldn't communicate very much, and so I felt very lonely. And so this new group kind of was filling that void and feeling Jesus for the first time, or at least some form of Jesus, right? And so then. Make sure I'm not. So then after he became, he was really mad. So things went from worse, from pretty not so good to much, much worse since I did this. And so we start to argue a lot and having a lot of trouble. And the weird thing is even though he knew the Mormon church was off, I was so confused, because now he was fighting for the Mormon church, and I felt like he was coming against me. He knew it wasn't true, but it was all he knew, and he knew that this little splinter off group, the remnant group, was crazier. And so he's like, oh my gosh, my family's gonna fall apart. And so he's fighting for us, but he's fighting against me. And in this crazy time, we decide we're still trying to make things work between us, and so we decided to go on this hike with another family, close family friends that were they were Christian. They were Mormon, and so we go up like 45 minutes away to go hiking, and we meet this little family at the little park as we were making a Dutch oven dinner, and this family are like the first Christians I've actually ever met in my life. We lived in the Mormon bubble of Mesa, Gilbert, Arizona, and at least Christians that were Jesus, really strong Jesus believers that showed their religion. So the mom, she mentions that she grew up a missionary child in Austria with her parents, and they would travel around Austria, and they'd stop this little tea bus that they had, and they would serve coffee and tea and preach the gospel. So that story just captured my attention. And so she had a little baby, and she had to go change the baby's diaper in the car. So Rinsley and I, we ran after her, trying to carefully not, tell James and this family that we were with, that we wanted to go talk to her. And so I whispered to her as we follow her to the car. She probably thought we were crazy. I'm like, so we're kind of questioning the Mormon church and stuff, but we really want to know more about Jesus. And so she's like, okay, yeah. So we exchanged phone numbers. Eventually, it's kind of a long story, but eventually we start going on walks. She turns out to live around the corner from us. And so we start going on walks, and she was, people often ask me okay, so if I'm ministering to a Mormon friend, what's a good way? I'll tell you, she was perfect at it. She never pushed it on us. I always felt, and she was experienced missionary and stuff, but she would always just very patient, always listening and answering my questions. And we would study the Bible together, and she would just say, so what do you think that means? But she never spoke anti-Mormon stuff to say, look, this is false and this is false, because my walls would have gone up. I wasn't ready for that, and she knew it. And so I would say that was the one thing that she did really right. And everybody that God put in our lives after that really had an effect on me were the same. They never pushed, they just let me kind of lead it. And so the more we talked, she realized that James and I were having a lot of trouble in our marriage. So I shared that with her, and she said, well, I've got some options for you. She said, I know this one counselor that is, he's just a regular counselor, not religious at all. And then my pastor, he's actually counseled many couples, and he's really helped them a lot. And so I'm like, okay, well, I can't go to a Mormon counselor, that's for sure. So I'm like, let me ask James, but I'm feeling like we should go to this pastor. So I don't tell James that he's a pastor. I think he shares this in his testimony. He actually tried to do the research to find out if who he was and what was his credentials. We couldn't find them. But he still agreed. And so we show up at the pastor's house, and I got there first. And so I get to share my whole story first. So I'm like, okay, good. I get to put one up on James. So I share my whole story, and the pastor, he's very good at listening, and it was so cool because he was so down to earth. I'd always had this picture from the Mormon church that, pastors outside of Mormonism, they're just getting money from the people, because you know how Mormons, their bishops are not paid and stuff. So you get this impression that pastors are just raking in the dough, but no, this pastor has very deep, normal house, very well kept, but nothing fancy at all. And he was just so down to earth. And so then James comes in, shares his story, and then the pastor says to me, well, Jolene, I'm really glad you're seeking for truth, but you still are off. Joseph Smith and Book of Mormon, they're not true. And then he just starts asking James, do you believe in absolute truth? And he shares this in his testimony. But it is stuck in my mind too with the pastor, because when James says, I have to say, I do believe in absolute truth. It's the only thing that makes sense. And he said, well, then you have the responsibility to find truth for your family. And I saw a light go on in James's mind. I could see that that really pierced his heart. And so up until that point, James had actually been pretty passive, because he was feeling so he knew the Mormon church wasn't true, and he wasn't actively participating with me. He'd still do his callings. But as far as family home evening, which we're supposed to have weekly, and prayer, he just, it wasn't in his heart. So I felt like I was dragging our family along all the time. And so, but all of a sudden, this pastor says this, and he goes and buys a red letter Bible, and for the first time, and is just reading nonstop. And I'm just getting mad because I'm thinking he's not reading the Denver's Never stuff. So anyway, so he gets this red letter Bible, and then on top of that, he's like reading like 5 different Christian books at a time. And this is, he's an attorney, so he reads all day long. And so he would, when he'd come home, he'd help me put the kids to bed, but he just wanted to watch TV usually after. But he's changing because all of a sudden he's like just reading all the time. And so he even goes on walks in our neighborhood reading. Like, how does he not trip? I don't know how he does that. So but I'm getting really mad because he's just, that's all he's doing. And so one day he says, I'm going to go up to this mountain and just like pray and just really have time with God. So I'm like, okay, God's going to show him. He's going to show him that I'm right. But he comes down from the mountain, and no, he briefly shares me. He didn't really share the whole experience because he just knew I was going to be upset and stuff, but just how God had really touched him and let him know that he was forgiven of his sins, and he comes to know Jesus. And so I just encourage you, if you're watching this video, to make sure you watch James's, because his story is amazing, and I'm just barely touching on stuff. But so then he, after that, he, a little bit later, gets baptized. I'm even more mad. And then after that happens, so our marriage is just, he's doing great. He's meeting with these people from this little church that, he continues to meet with the pastor, and and he's loving this little church. So they're called Two Rivers, and they're in Gilbert, Arizona. I love now, like back then, I actually felt one thing with, like, as I was coming to know Jesus and I was spending time, in the secret place, and even though my idea of who God was totally skewed, like I was beginning to hear God. The problem was, like in Mormonism, they never teach you that there's different voices. They always, like, you have this impression that anytime you hear something in your mind, it's always going to be God. And so I was struggling with, I was hearing the enemy. I know I was, but I didn't know it then. And I was hearing God sometimes, and so I felt like, so I went to visit one time. Amy's like, okay, you need to just come visit our church. And so this little church is called Two Rivers because it's the emphasis on the Bible. So they're very biblical, but also the Holy Spirit. So they're a more charismatic type church, but very biblically sound. And so we walk in, and people, it's like rock music. I'd only been to Mormon churches before, and people are loving God. Their hands are raised. Even my friend Amy, she's up in the front, kneeling down, and everybody's just worshiping freely. And so I'm like, this is so weird. And so I'm talking to God in my mind, and I'm like, is this you, God? Could this be you? And I didn't share this with James at the time because something really strange happened, and I really hear very clearly in my mind. I'm not saying it was the audible voice of God, but it was a very clear impression from God saying, you don't know me. And I'm like, what? Do you know you? And then I'm thinking, that was Satan talking to me. And then a little bit later in the worship service, I just feel like I hear the voice say, these people really love me. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, I don't know what to do with that. I just shelf it because I don't know how to deal with that. But in the meantime, James is really like enjoying the people he's meeting there at Two Rivers and really growing in his testimony. But I'm still with this little remnant group. And he, as he's coming to the Lord, he's just, he's fighting for our family because I'm still teaching the kids out of Pearl of Great Price, and there's some really crazy stuff in there. And so he's, because we were homeschooling at the time, and so he's really like almost arguing with me daily. And finally, he just at one time I'm just like, I just need you to leave me alone about it, and I'm tired of the voices, because we were also meeting with Pastor Tom, and every time we'd get together with Pastor Tom, he was trying to convince me too, and so I was just feeling beat up. So I'm like, please just let God do it. I don't want to hear anybody else's opinion. I just want God. And so he actually kind of left me alone for the most part, and that was better, because then I felt like it opened up the door for God to start doing it his own way. And And I actually stopped going to counseling with Pastor Tom because I felt like he was at me too much. And he's such a good pastor. Like, he's so sweet. Later on, as the story progresses, I did share with him that I was kind of upset about how I felt like they would just, like, our counseling sessions were all about, like, trying to convince me that Mormonism wasn't true. And he's like, I'm sorry, I just kind of broke a lot of the rules because I knew that once you didn't believe in that anymore, that a lot would fall off and that things would get a lot better. And he's right, but God had to do it in his way. And so I felt like God was saying to me in those moments, I'm going to be your counselor. Because I was just, every time we left that counseling session, I was just crying. And so then after that, it was really amazing to see how God showed up, because every time we would have an argument, and I'd just go crying to like my little prayer room, where I just had kind of converted to my little room, and I just start talking to God, and I knew he could see everything that had happened, both sides of the story, and he would just, like, I would just feel his presence, and he would just, like, hug me, and I would know that he was there. And then but then he would chastise me, but it was so loving. It was just so interesting how he would be like, this is what you did wrong. And this, and so he'd give me, like, he just gave me eyesight to see things from his perspective. And it was amazing. And so then I would go and I'd apologize to James. And this went on for quite a few months. And so things were slowly getting better. And James was still meeting with Pastor Tom. So it was good for him too. And then at that point, let me see where I was at. I lost my train of thought, sorry. And so things are getting a little bit better. And there's a point in time, though, where God started to put different people in our lives. And he put, like, this, I started to have this, I know what it was, the remnant group. There was a moment where some of the family groups were getting kind of split off, and people were getting a little bit mad at each other. So it was kind of bad in a way that, as it was good at first, the remnant group would get together, and a lot of it would be venting. And I think this happens to a lot of Mormons as they leave the Mormon church. There's a period of healing that has to go on, and they're mad. They've been deceived forever. And so there's a lot of hurt. And so there was a lot of venting that went on. But slowly, like, Rinsley and I had been there for a while, and the venting got to be too much. Like, it was just like we wanted something more positive. And so we found out about this little Messianic church that was nearby. And I always had this draw to the Hebrew roots. I just wanted to know more. And so we went and visited one Friday night. It was their Shabbat service, and this guy from Israel was speaking. And he's talking about how in Israel, there's this movement, and all these Jewish people are coming to know Jesus. And the story was amazing, and it just, like, spoke to my heart, because Mormons believe that in the last days that the Jewish people's eyes are going to be open, and they're going to start coming into Mormonism and realize they're the true church. Well, I didn't know a single one. And so I'm like, okay, I don't think that's it. So I'm like, that was really cool. So I'm feeling led to keep going to this little Messianic church. And so we went to a Bible study that they said they were going to have. And we go, and the woman that was speaking, she was a minister for over 40 years and had been to Israel like 30 times. And her story was amazing. She was a nurse first, but then had gotten like several doctorate degrees in theology, and then she'd even studied at Hebrew University for a while. And she was an amazing teacher. And she was teaching that day on Abraham and the sacrifice of his son, Isaac. And it was just, there was so much depth and understanding and how it related to Jesus, and I was just blown away. So Rinsley and I, after her teaching, we follow her out to the car. We follow people out to the car a lot. So we're like, hey, we're really, we're coming out of Mormonism. We really want to learn the Bible. We would love it if we could do a Bible study or something with you. And so she shares that her husband had died about 5 years before. No, I think it was 4 years before at that time. And there was like, she was like trying to catch up with taxes, and she kind of just had a mess and she couldn't do it. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm a CPA. I'm like, so I'm like, I will help you, and then you teach us. And so she was like, okay. So it was such a God moment, And so Rinsley and I started to go to her house, and she had this amazing library, and Rinsley would help her organize her library, and I would help her with the texts, and I'd ask her questions. And she started to teach us about the holy days. And oh my goodness, like I have such a great love for the holy days. They just speak to me so much about Jesus, what he's done, what he's gonna do. It's truly amazing to me. And so and I'm starting to see, so as we keep going to this little church, but we're still going to the remnant group too. So and they know it, this little, it was called Beth Emmanuel. They knew that we still weren't fully Christian, but we still love to go with them. And just on Friday nights we go there, and then Sunday mornings we go to the remnant group. And so at Beth Emmanuel, they would celebrate these holy days, and it was always just such a blast. But now I'm starting to see, okay, something's going on here, because if you know the Book of Mormon much at all, it starts out with Lehi. Lehi is the patriarch of this family, and he's a very God-fearing, God-loving man, and he's just, a Jewish man. So he's told by God to leave Jerusalem at the time of Jeremiah, because it's going to be, destroyed, and people are going to be dispersed. And so he leaves, and that's where the story begins of the Book of Mormon. Well, I'm realizing, I've read the Book of Mormon many times. I've loved the Book of Mormon. I've probably read it 20 times. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, how come there's nothing about the holy days in there? If this man was really a good, God-fearing man, he would have been, at least there would have been some reference, and to the holy days, or, to Passover, or to sacrifices, something, but there's nothing in there. And so that was another, one thing where I'm like, that's interesting, but I shelved it. and then God, as James is getting to know people at Two Rivers, he starts to connect me with some of the people he's meeting. And there was this woman that had an amazing story. We go on a hike with her and her family, and she starts sharing about how one of her daughters did a summer camp at Bethel. And so she went to go pick up her daughter at Bethel, and she said, as we were leaving, we decided to go to the bookstore, and there's a man in there, and I had a huge lump on my leg, and I was going to get it biopsied. It was super painful, and I was really worried. This is what she's telling me. She thought it was going to be cancer. But this man says, hey, I feel like I need to pray for you. And so she's like, okay, that's fine. And he's like, what do you have going on? And she told him about her leg. And so he prays for her. And the lump just disintegrates. It's gone in that very moment. And then he's like, I feel like there's something else. And she's like, no, there's nothing else. He's like, no, I really think so. Is there anything? And she's like, well, I've been dealing with it forever, but I have bipolar. I have bipolar disorder, and he's like, let me pray for that. And so she's like, okay. So he prays for her bipolar disorder, and she doesn't really feel anything at that moment, but she goes home and she's feeling pretty good. And this just doesn't leave her mind, and so she's like, asks her husband, is it okay with you if I go off? And he's like, well, I don't know. It's been a nightmare when you've gone off before. So he was really nervous about saying okay to this. So he's like, why don't you just taper off, maybe every 2 days miss one, and just kind of do it like that. So slowly taper off. So she does that, and she's totally fine. And at this point, when I'm talking to her, it had been 8 years, and she never an episode ever again. And so I'm like, okay, I've never heard. And Amy, as we walk, she's telling me about amazing things that are happening at Two Rivers, different healings and stuff. I'm like, I've never heard of anything like this in Mormonism, not even in this remnant group. And so I'm like, that's kind of interesting. There's all this power over here, but I'm not seeing any of that in Mormonism, and it's supposed to be the one true church. So, And so anyway, and then I started to just be really drawn to different online videos, Todd White's testimony of how he, just from the depths of despair and suicide and drugs and being in jail, how God lifts him up out of that, and then now he just just goes all over and heals and people just in the name of Jesus. So Rinsley and I are starting to get courage, and we're like, oh my gosh, we need to start praying like that. And so then Rinsley at this point got this really bad eye infection. It was really bad. Her eye was huge. And I'm like, Rinsley, we just need to have faith. We're going to pray there. It's probably kind of scary looking back that we took such a big chance. So we just started praying, and I'm just like, okay, in Jesus' name, we're just, commanding it to get healed. It heals. She's okay. And the eye totally heals. And so I started praying like that for my boys. Ethan, our youngest, used to get really bad growing pains at night. And I would start praying and just holding his legs, and he'd be crying. And I'd pray like that, and all of a sudden, the pain just goes away and stuff, and he would just relax and he'd fall asleep. And so I saw that God was moving, but I still have a lot of error in my life. There's a lot of theological junk and stuff. But I think, in a way, this is why he also protected our kids, even though we're fighting like every day. I think he saw that James and I, even though I had this error, like God knew my heart was like to just know him at all costs. I was willing to trade everything, and James had already come to know Jesus, and there were so many people praying for us, and so eventually it comes to a point where this is okay. So see how we're not doing on time, but James and I were really struggling, and it's just getting really bad, and we're at this point where I'm like, I just don't think that James and I are gonna, I'm not having hope for our marriage. Like, things are really good for him, and he's like really loving Jesus, and it's really good for me with my group, but together we're a mess and always fighting. And so I just tell James one day, I'm like, look, if things don't get better in the next week, I'm gonna go spend two weeks with my mom, and I'm just gonna figure things out, because I just don't know if I can handle it. And I wouldn't have divorced, because I was reading the Bible enough to know that I needed to like do what God said, and so, but I thought maybe we'd separate or something. And so but God does something really amazing in that week. It wasn't even that James did anything new. He wasn't like becoming my friend more. He wasn't talking to me more. But a few things happened where I should have been really mad, but God gave me like this power of grace, to just not be offended. And then one day he started singing at the kitchen table a worship song, and I'm like, okay, James never sings. So to me that was a sign like that God was going to help me get through this process. And so I'm like, so I canceled the trip. I'm like, no, it's okay. And I just like prayed, and I felt like God said, I am going to fix this marriage in a way that you have no clue, like that you'll never be able to imagine. And James was getting kind of similar, experience, that God was telling him that things were going to be okay. And I think he had more hope because he had Jesus, and I didn't really, but I knew that when I heard God say that, it couldn't have been the enemy, because I had like no hope, and I knew enough to know that the enemy would have just told me, yeah, you just don't have hope. So I knew to hang in there. So in that time, my friend that I was telling you about, the minister, she asks Rinsley and I, can I pray for you guys for a spirit of deception? If there's a spirit of deception, that it could be gone, I'm like, yeah, why not? Like, I believe like what I'm believing is true, but sure, it doesn't hurt. I want truth. So we let her pray. And it was one night after like one of the Sabbath services at Beth Emmanuel. And so she prays a really powerful prayer just to command, any spirit of deception to be gone. And Rinsley starts bawling. She's just like sobbing. Mom, she's right. It's not true. And I'm like, what? I'm not feeling that. And so we go in the house, and I'm like, and I just convinced Rinsley again. No, Rinsley, it's true. This remnant group that we're part of, it's true. So I think inside she knew it wasn't already, but she wanted to please her mom. So she's like, okay. So we continue believing. But I feel like that prayer was so powerful. It continued to work, because as soon after that, James and I, we're getting a little better. Things are getting a little better. And so we go and have this weekend away at a really nice hotel there in Arizona. And I was just kind of trying to make a decision. I'd had this job offer from my CPA firm that I first worked for out of college. And they're like, hey, come work for us. We're opening up the Phoenix office, and you can work part-time. And so I was homeschooling the kids, but I was thinking I could juggle it and like have Rinsley be the nanny in the afternoons and do their afternoon stuff, and I'd just do the mornings. But it was a hard decision, so I was asking James, and I can't remember. He said something that really bothered me. And so we were swimming at the time at one of the pools. And so I dive under because I just didn't want to hear him. And so I was just like hiding from him in the water. And I hear God say, you have made James your idol. I'm like, what? Never heard of that. In Mormonism, they don't talk about idols. Because everything, there's so many idols, right? So I'm like, what? And so I come up out of the water. I'm like, I've made you my idol. And he probably thought I was crazy at the time. But so we went to dinner and just kind of put that aside for a bit. But then in the morning, that thought would not leave my mind. And I just kept thinking, oh my gosh, what does that mean? And how do I let go? I don't want to have an idol. I want just God to be the first one in my heart. And so I start trying to talk to him. He's like, Jolene, I can't go there with you, because the conversation was sounding condemning to him. And I wasn't trying to condemn him. I was just trying to make sense of it. I'm like, so, isn't your husband supposed to do all these different things? Aren't you supposed to have some expectations? And so that's the kind of conversation I was trying to have with him. He's like, I just can't go there. So he leaves and he goes to the pool, and I'm just in the hotel room. And as I'm there just on the floor, just crying to God, I'm like, yeah, please, I don't know how to get rid of this idol. What do I do? And so I'm hearing a voice start talking to me, and he's saying, well, you just can't expect perfection. No marriage is perfect, and you just have to kind of suffer through it. And gratefully, I think, I had read enough of the Bible, because my minister friend that I prayed for deception to go away, she said, I just challenge you, put the Mormon stuff aside for a little bit and just read the New Testament, and God's going to let you know what's the counterfeit. And so I had started to do that. And so I think I had enough in me that I started to recognize, wait a second, this is not God that's talking to me. So I get really mad, and I yell at the top of my lungs, for it to be gone in Jesus' name. And so then I start to hear God, and I'm just sobbing, God, I just don't want to have an idol, but I don't know what to do. And he walks me through a really interesting process that I had never heard before. But now I know that in a lot of healing ministries, they do similar things, but I didn't know that then. So he's like, just list all the different offenses you have, and all the offenses against James. And I'm like, that's weird. Shouldn't I be trying to forget them? But I do it. And then he walks me through each one. And he gives me his heart, or James's heart, an understanding of why this was happening and where James was at this point. And then he's like, now give it to me and forgive him. And so I do this for each one of the things. And an amazing weight is just lifted. Even though it was just all words, they had power. It was so amazing just to give these things to God. I'm like, how could this work? So I was feeling a lot better. And then he's like, now I need you to write a letter to James, asking his forgiveness for making him your idol. So I'm like, okay. So I write the letter and I go meet him at the pool. And as I'm coming down, it's just a total miracle. It's supernatural. Just all this hurt and offenses were just falling off, just melting. It was so weird. And so then I get there and I hand him the letter, and he's reading A.W. Tozer, The Pursuit of God. And so he reads the letter and he's like, this is so weird. He's like, I'm on this chapter about idols. And, and in here he's talking about how it feels it's physical almost, where it just feels like a tearing of the heart. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's what I was going through. It was just a tearing. It felt so painful. But then, so it was amazing. All this amazing stuff happened, but I'm still believing my false stuff, Poor James. He's on a roller coaster with me. We'd have some breakthrough, but then I was still there. So one day, then we go, we're doing better and better. And we're one day at my friend's house, the minister's house. And Rinsley and I are helping her in the library. And I pull out this book, Kingdom of the Cults. Never heard of this before. What's this? And she's like, oh, there's an interesting chapter in there about Mormonism. So I'm like, what? I'm like, Mormons are not, that's not a cult. She's like, well, and she starts to explain what a cult is. And so I'm like, oh, I guess it kind of fits. But I'm like, but no. And she's like, and Mormons believe they can become gods, And I'm like, well, they can. And so I'm like, I promise, I'm going to show you all the scriptures. And so I go home and I do all my homework and I got all my list of scriptures, biblical scriptures, like from the Bible, that are going to prove to her that we can become gods. And I start writing this email, and I totally hear like from God again. And just to clarify, like when I hear from God, it's not audible. It's more of just a mind thought, and and it usually comes with joy and like more clear and stuff than just any normal thought. And so he says, stop, don't write it. It's not true. I'm like, what? Okay. Oh my God. And so I just go into my little prayer room and I'm crying. I'm like trying to make sense of this. And just in that one quick moment, very like important thing comes out, that I'm like realizing that God is saying, there's only one God. And what James had been trying to drill into me, I remember one day we were in the middle of an argument, and I'll never forget, he just said, Jolene, I have clarity on this. There's only one God. And like finally that was like, okay, yeah, he's right. And then it was like, yeah, we cannot become gods. So in one quick moment, he did all that. And so I share with James. And I know he's thinking, okay, this is it. She's got it, right? But no. I'm like, no, but I thought I could actually see the Book of Mormon is actually pretty biblical in some ways. There's Alma chapter 11 actually talks about the Trinity. And so I'm thinking, well, maybe Joseph Smith just got misled later. So maybe it's just like, so I'm still justifying stuff. But so anyway, time goes forward. And now this is 2016. So James had been Christian for 2 years, and without me. And so I did accept that position with that CPA firm, and I am scheduled to go on a company retreat, and he's going to a men's retreat at our church. So I'm on my way, because we were going to be passing, because we weren't going to see each other, because he was coming home on Sunday and I was leaving, and so he just texts me and he says, I'm on my way home. I'm a little bit injured. And he said, and so I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm glad you're okay. But then I think for a second, I'm like, okay, James planes. He has to be for him to say that, he had to be really injured. So I'm like, okay, can you expand on that? He was like, well, I was playing football, and I just think it's separated ribs. And right away, I'm thinking, I know, I'm like, no, I think there's more. I'm like, what if you should go to the doctor. I'm like, because what if it's like a punctured lung? That's what first came to my mind. He's like, no, I'm fine. I just need a rest. And so, I go, and that night I had this really nice hotel room to myself. And so I'm like, I'm just going to spend time with God. And it was so good. And I'm just praying, and I'm just reading my scriptures, and just go to bed normally. And then I decide to wake up in the morning before the sun goes up, comes up, and I'm praying and just reading my scriptures again. And then as I'm almost ready to head down to the retreat that was at the hotel, so I had some time, I start reading through some emails. And so the Remnant group had this group email that they would have, and the director, remember the director that I was of the school, she had written an email to say that Denver Snuffer had a vision, and Joseph Smith, or I don't know if it was a vision or actually happened, I don't know, but Joseph Smith appeared to him and was giving him like some instructions. And then I get this like pit in my stomach, and I'm like, what? Where's that coming from? Like, and I never have something like that happen. And so I remember this conversation with the minister, my minister friend, where because her husband had passed away and they were very close, she was sharing how she just missed him so much, she'd often get teary-eyed. And so one day I said, do you wish like your husband would come and like appear to you and just like kind of comfort you? And she's like, oh no, I never go there. That's not, that the Bible's very strictly tells you you're not allowed to speak to the dead. And so, but I didn't think anything of it when she mentioned it at that moment. But in this moment, in that hotel room, reading that email, it comes back to me, and I'm like, oh my gosh. That is what the whole Mormon faith is based on. Because the Book of Mormon, if you know how it came to be, was that the angel Moroni came and appeared to Joseph Smith, told him where the golden plates were, and that's where it all started, right? So, but angel Moroni is not an angel. He is a prophet from the Book of Mormon, if he was even a prophet. So I'm like, oh my gosh, like, the whole Book of Mormon, everything after that, because Joseph Smith also claims that John the Baptist came to him, Elijah came to him, all these prophets to restore all these keys, right, that had been lost. That's why the restoration was so important. So I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm like, the whole thing, it's a lie. The whole thing is a lie. And so I text my friend, my minister friend, where are those scriptures in the Bible? Really quick. And so she sends me a whole bunch. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And so I'm like, but I wasn't sad. Like before, when I started to, there were moments when I'd start to think the Mormon church was not true. And I would just be like devastated. I'd just be crying. I couldn't handle it. But in this moment, all of a sudden, it was pure joy and freedom. Like, I'm like, oh my gosh. It's none of it's true. And then I remember the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? Like this boy that throws a rock into the side of a mountain in the 1940s, and it comes crashing down, right? And they find that the Isaiah scrolls, they match up almost exactly to the Bible. And then I'm thinking, James has done so much research, and I knew that too, that I could rely on the Bible, which the book, Mormonism says that it's only true as far as it's translated correctly. So pretty much when it doesn't line up with doctrine, you throw it out, with Mormon doctrine. So all this is coming to my mind in this one moment, and I just can't wait to get home after this, retreat and go tell James. So we go through the retreat, and then James calls me just right about the end of it, and he's like, well, I went to the chiropractor because I just thought my ribs were out of place, and they take an x-ray, and then the chiropractor proceeds to adjust to me. Well, apparently, and he's like, I almost pass out. And so apparently he had the x-ray flipped. Oh my God. And so he tried to adjust these broken ribs, and he actually had a punctured lung. And so he's like, so Rinsley takes him to the emergency room, and I meet them there. Like, I was in Tucson, which is like an hour and a half from Gilbert, Arizona. So I meet them there, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, and we're just praying for him, and he has to go through 2 procedures with no anesthesia, and it was really bad. I felt so bad. And then, but I tell Rinsley, will you go home and be with the boys? And I will stay with James. Like, I really wanted to stay with him because he's just this strong guy. Like, if he really was in pain, I know he wouldn't even speak up. So I'm like, I gotta speak up for him. So I stay, and then in the morning he's in less pain, and I just go and I lay by his side, and I'm like, I've got something to tell you. I'm like, so at the retreat, and I share what happened, and he's like, oh my gosh, and like the joy in that room and the darkness that lifted from our relationship, from our family, was amazing. Like, I know now, like, I didn't know enough about like demonic stuff, but I know there's a demonic hold on the Mormon church and on the people, because it was so tangible, the darkness that lifted, and just the distance between it was just gone like that. Even though we still had stuff to work on. I mean, God had already done a lot of amazing things, and he continues to do amazing things, and our marriage and our relationship is better than it ever has been. I mean, we've become like best friends, where before that wasn't even possible. And so it was just amazing how that darkness lifted, and things it changed so much from then on, and the joy, and I became a crazy Christian. They probably should have put me in a closet for a year to calm down, because I would get on Facebook and I'd be like, just totally testify. I offended so many people. But then I slowly calmed down, figured out how to witness to people in a little better way. But I just thought, people just don't know. They just need to know, and then they're going to see what I can see. But look how long it took me. I should have known better. So anyway, but like my encouragement to just people that are seeking, just Mormons out there that might just be wondering if it's true, is just just seek it out. It's worth every moment. Even as James and I came out and we had people that wouldn't talk to us anymore. I mean, nobody was really bad. I can't say that we had people that were like really persecuting us, but there was a lot of distance and people that didn't really want to talk to us anymore. But it didn't feel horrible. Like, I think because we had the love of Jesus in our hearts, it was so bearable and it was so worth it. And then also just like if they have a marriage, like if you out there and are listening to this, if your marriage is struggling, like I can just testify to you, just pray. Oh my goodness, the power of prayer and all the people that were praying for us. It is so powerful. Just like it has the power to move mountains, and it's just done amazing things in our marriage. I mean, I seriously thought we were not going to make it, but it's been so amazing to see what God has done. And so, yeah, that is my side of the story. Hopefully it lines up good with James. But yeah. So if anybody has any questions, yeah, I'd be happy to answer if there was anything I missed.
So it never occurred to you, I mean, I've heard this from other LDS people, they say, well, these Moroni, Joseph Smith, they're not really dead because they resurrected. Right?
Yeah.
So they've got their resurrected body now. So when you have your resurrected body, they're not really dead. So you're not really communicating with these dead spirits. So did you ever think about that possibility? And
no, you know what? No, I hadn't thought of it. I actually hadn't heard that as an argument towards that. Yeah. And then the way that my friend, the minister friend had described it, it didn't really matter. Like because even, so you know the story of the Mount of Transfiguration and Jesus up there with, and Elijah and Moses up here. Even in that moment, to her, it was more about like, you should not take advice from any dead, any resurrected or anybody dead, because there's too much room for deception. And so even that Mount of Transfiguration like experience, they were not giving any kind of advice. It was just like kind of an appearance to to communicate an idea, but that's kind of, I hadn't even heard of that argument. That's interesting. I wouldn't buy it, but not now anyway, maybe back then. But that's what's amazing about the journey that God took me in, and as crazy as this roller coaster was, and all along I was always asking God, just show me, please, I just want the truth. I feel like he had to do it the way that he did for me, because I feel like maybe if I had just a couple of things like made me realize that it wasn't true, that I might have at one point said, I'm not sure, like maybe I made the wrong decision. But the way he did it was so many layers coming off that by the end, like I knew without a doubt that the Mormon church was completely off, even the splinter off group. And so I just would never ever doubt again. So
here's a passage that deals with that Hebrews 11:39. It says, these all, going through the list of faith believers, these all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. So no one has the resurrected body yet.
Okay.
Okay.
That's really good to in case I do come up with somebody that's trying to say that. What was that? What were those verses again?
Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 39 and 40. The last two verses of 11.
Okay, Hebrews 11, 39 and 40. That's good. That's really good. Yeah. Yeah.
Did that, the remnant group you're in, do they do anything with temples? Did they...
Oh, yeah.
Or is there, because obviously they split off.
Mm-hmm.
The main one has all the temples, right? So do they not believe that anymore?
Yeah, so they still believe, but they believe that there's only supposed to be one, not all the ones that the Mormon church has built. And so they, and I haven't followed them, to be honest, for quite a while. But, the groups that we were meeting with, quite a few of them there in Gilbert, Arizona, moved up to Idaho. Because, what's very characteristic of these cult-type groups is to think the end is coming. We need to go gather here and it's about here. So many families just left their jobs and everything and they went up there and they were going to start building a temple. But as they got up there was a lot of contention. And so just like what happens, you've heard about these groups. So they pretty much fell apart. I think all of them are, well, not all of them, but there's been a few actually that have become Christian from those groups. But many of them are just kind of just separated, but they're still up there. And as far as I know, they haven't started a new temple, but they're planning on it. So yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
I just think it's fascinating that, because the whole Mormon doctrine and stuff, like, they're just obsessed with the dead. Like, they do the works for the dead in the temple.
Oh, yeah.
And, like, I remember when I first came out thinking,
Yeah.
like, where is this in the Bible, or really even the Book of Mormon
Yeah.
that talks about, like, doing all this work for the dead?
Yeah.
And, like, even still today, I find it kind of fascinating because Mormons will all the time say, oh, yeah, I went and saw this, like, what are they called? Psychic, or this, you know, and talk to my dead relative, and I'm like, oh yeah, they still believe all of this stuff.
Yeah.
But it's totally demonic, and you
It's
read it
so
in the Bible,
demonic.
and you're like, this is not good. Like,
No.
it's just awkward, yeah. But
Yeah.
my hairdresser, she's somewhat Mormon, but she said something about how, like, her friend went to see a psychic, and my kids are sitting there, and they're just, like, being quiet, and then they go, that's, like, totally demonic. And I'm like, yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's really good. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like, I've noticed, too, in Mormonism, as things are changing, and they're just, I don't know, it's very strange, but just how many people are also into just like energy healing.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, so I'm very drawn like to healing, just after seeing so many miracles. And actually, I didn't even share this. God even healed me in this process, in this journey. I had leaky gut for like 9 years, and He healed me like miraculously. It was really amazing, and I've been fine since. But so I'm very drawn to that. And so these, like, I know so many Mormon people that are getting into this energy healing. But the strange thing is, every single one of them that I know, like, they're themselves really sick. And so I think they do pick up these negative, like, demonic energies. And so it's just not good. But it's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Did you ever think about that, though, when you were thinking about the dead people talking, where you were like, oh yeah, and in the temple we're doing all this stuff for dead people, like...
It didn't even like click. What did I do? One scripture I do remember, like reading how Paul like says to stop doing like endless genealogies, and I'm like, why do we do that in the Mormon church? That did, but you know how like they just justify everything. Like if it doesn't match up to what Joseph Smith taught, then they just throw it out. It doesn't line up with doctrine. So. Yeah. One thing I didn't share, I think is kind of interesting, one realization that I had was Denver Snuffer was very big on teaching about Mormons becoming gods. And so he would talk about the King Follett. And I feel like this is important because recently I was meeting with a good friend of ours who she's come out of the Mormon church like 2 years ago, but she still is figuring things out because she didn't leave for doctrine issues. She was strangely getting migraines every time she was about to go to church. So she started going to a Christian church and the migraines stopped. And so she's still peeling away doctrine. And so she was really struggling with the idea of the triune, God, and not three is in one. And so we were talking about that, and I was just remembering, like, so Denver Snuffer really like teaches the King Follett discourse, which is one that Joseph Smith gave for a funeral service that he did, and he really brings out very clearly, and it's actually in LDS.org, you can just find it on there, it's not hidden, but he talks about very clearly that as God, or as we are, God once was. And he just kind of goes into how, that Jesus was the prototype of the saved man. And it's interesting when you put God, and James used to try it, as he's trying to help me understand, he would try to show, look, at God is just so much bigger than what Mormons are saying. He's not this little God. And it was just, he would, so he was, saying that we could just become like him. And then you start to realize that, oh my goodness, that if if Jesus was just trying to gain an earth, and that's what they're teaching, that's what Joseph Smith taught, that he came and he died for us, and then he became the God of this world, and it was just to attain, it was just more works, it was his works. And so then you start to realize, that's why I think Mormons don't really understand the love of God, because they think, in the back of their minds, they wouldn't say this to your face because they don't really understand their own doctrine, but Jesus attained this world by dying for us. It wasn't pure love like we know it is. Like, God didn't have to come down and save us. It's like such an amazing, extravagant love that he has for us, and he didn't need to do this. And he did, just all for love, and no benefit to him, but just to be our knight in shining armor, Yeah.
With the Snufferites, if Snuffer says that there were no prophets past Joseph Smith, does he believe that he's a prophet?
That's, good question.
And then I guess what wasn't part of what Joseph Smith said, there had to be living prophets. So what happened, what after he died?
What happened after
was there
he
somebody
died?
actually who wasn't within the organized church, and they were like the start of the remnant?
Yeah. How he explains it is, so Joseph Smith, so the people that were following Joseph Smith, that they were not living the gospel the way Joseph Smith was teaching them. So they were making a lot of mistakes, and that's how he explains how Joseph Smith's prophecies didn't come true, is because the people, they didn't do what they were supposed to. So then their beloved prophet was taken from them because they weren't doing what they were supposed to. And so then he explains it that there was no prophet at that time. And so yes, he at first, when he was coming out and writing these books, he was not calling himself a prophet. But everybody was kind of revering him like a prophet. I remember I went to a conference that they did in Moab, actually. And so he came and he just shows up like right when he was supposed to speak and then left like that. And he said he did that because he didn't want to get a big head. He doesn't want people but slowly his blog, he was just slowly putting out just little hints that he was like the next prophet, the next real prophet.
So it's like a Restoration Part 2.
Totally. Exactly.
So you have your Dark Ages too, after Joseph Smith,
Are they
the Great Apostasy, and then you have the Restoration through Denver.
Yes, exactly. That is what he is trying to recreate. And what's interesting, the remnant group, they started to have these conversations. This was really interesting. And they were saying that the new covenant, they were trying to figure out what's the new covenant. Because Denver was saying that Joseph Smith didn't get a chance to reveal the new covenant because he was going to reveal the new covenant. That didn't have anything to do with Jesus. So I'm really confused this whole time. I remember asking James, I'm like, James, what do you think that means? And he's like, well, it's Jesus. When Jesus came, he revealed the new covenant. But I felt like there was more to it. And James was still kind of he would explain a lot more elaborate now, but this was kind of as a new Christian. And so I went to, I started to research online. There was a ministry I used to follow called 119 Ministries. They're very Hebrew roots and but very biblical. And they said it's like that Jesus gave us the Holy Spirit, right? And that it would dwell with us, and the word would be written on our hearts, and that was part of the new covenant. And so I was like, okay, that's a little better. But then I went and asked my minister friend, and because she has the Hebrew roots and is able to kind of put some pieces together I had never heard of before, she explained the Bible, the story, which I had never really heard it put together. It's just such a beautiful love story, of Jesus and how he's wooed us and how he chose the Jewish people. And then in the time of Jeremiah, he divorced them because of what happened. And she said, so in Jewish law, you can't remarry somebody that you've divorced. Mm-hmm. And so when Jesus came again, he had to die so that when he came back, so that he could remarry his people. And of course, he extended it to the Gentiles, now. But it was just she explained it in the way of the Jewish wedding, and how Jesus was we were betrothed to him, and then we and then he came, and he like that when he died and he was on the cross, it was like his betrothal, and then he had to go up to heaven and prepare a place for us, and that's why eventually he will come down and he'll gather his bride. And so she's explaining this whole story a little more eloquently than I could, and I just started to cry. Like, I had never heard that before, that we were his bride. I'm like, Mormons don't talk about that. I never understood those passages in the New Testament to mean that. And that just like, it was amazing, like hearing that for the first time. Just so cool. Yeah. So any other questions? All right.
They're not part of that Lori Daybell group, are they? They're another offshoot.
Yeah, another offshoot, because I haven't heard of that one. There are so many, I know. And what's interesting, like Mormons always like criticize Christians because we have all these different sects, but they do too. So, every time somebody doesn't agree, they have a splinter off group. Yeah. So yeah.
But it's similar, and prophecy, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
New prophets.
Yeah, new prophets that come up because they're trying to make sense of all that doesn't make sense, So, yeah, but as we've been Christians, God has like continued to transform us. I like see the miracle of grace. Like, it didn't really speak to me as it did James, like the whole grace thing. I think I shared like as part of the question and answer time when he was sharing, is that, as Mormons, we have two like mindsets. There's either those that feel like lots of shame and intense guilt, like they can never attain what their, salvation. But then there's like I thought I was good. I'm like, I was good at checking off the checklist, and I thought, even if I did mess up a little, I thought, what, God knows my heart. I'm good. And so grace and like the Bible didn't really like speak to me. I kind of needed to see that there was like, I needed to start seeing the power that there was in Jesus, and as God put these people around me in our life, and so then I started to see how the both, all of it fit together, and it's just so amazing. So,
would you close us in prayer?
Oh yeah, sure. Okay. Of our Father, we just thank you so much for this time together. We thank you for what you've done in each one of our lives, and we thank you for your love and how you've rescued us all. And we're so grateful for your Son. Thank you for sending him, and that how he died on the cross for us and spilt his pure and precious blood to bring us closer to you, and that you walk with us, and that as we can have you in our lives every day, we thank you that you show up and that you are so present in our lives. And so we just pray that as we close, that you will continue to be with us, and thank you for keeping us safe as we came, and we pray that you also keep us safe as we leave. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.